$26.70. That was the total take from the most infamous bank job in American history. Not $26 each, $26.70 for the entire gang combined. 3 men were dead. 3 more were captured and sentenced to life in prison. And the only 2 who made it out rode away with barely enough cash between them to buy a decent meal. Welcome to Spent Brass. I'm Clay, and today we are pulling back the curtain on what it actually meant to live as an outlaw in the American West. Not the legend, not the version they printed in dime novels and sold for a nickel at train stations. The real thing. The grinding, paranoid, genuinely broke reality of what life looked like in the long stretches between the jobs. Subscribe if this is your first time here. Drop a comment telling me what you assumed outlaw life was like before you hit play, and let's get into it. The picture most people carry of the Wild West outlaw is a confident one. A man who rides into a saloon, drops his hat on the bar, orders whatever he likes, and does not look over his shoulder. Maybe plays a hand of cards, gets recognized, and the room goes quiet, out of respect. That picture was mostly fiction, and the men who actually tried to live this way knew it better than anyone, usually within the first year or 2 of trying. For the James Younger gang, for Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, for Bill Doolin and his Oklahombres, the majority of any given year was spent doing exactly one thing above all others: staying invisible. After a job, the first priority was never celebration, it was distance. A gang coming off a train or bank robbery needed to be 50 or 60 miles from the scene before the nearest telegraph operator had time to wire the details ahead to the next town's lawman. That meant long night rides through whatever weather was available, rotating horses when possible, and often splitting into pairs or single riders to make tracking harder. Riding together kept the group visible and easy to identify. Riding alone meant you had nobody watching your back. There was no arrangement that felt safe, because nothing was. When the riding finally stopped, you needed somewhere to go, and that meant safe houses. The network of farms, ranches, and remote homesteads that sheltered major outlaw gangs through the 1880s and 1890s was not the romantic brotherhood the dime novels suggested. It was a transaction. Farmers and ranchers across Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma Territory, and the canyon country of Utah and Wyoming would take in wanted men in exchange for cash, favors, or simply out of a calculation about what might happen to a family that said no. Jesse James reportedly rotated through a network of several dozen sympathetic families in Missouri alone during the peak years of the gang's operation. Some of those families genuinely believed in what the James brothers represented. They saw Jesse and Frank as men pushing back against the railroads and the banks that were squeezing ordinary people off their land. But most were simply doing the math and deciding that quiet cooperation was the safer position. What that shelter actually looked like from day to day was not romantic. It was weeks, sometimes months, spent in back rooms, barns, and root cellars. Moving during daylight was a risk. Walking into any nearby town for any reason was a calculated gamble every single time, because a recognized outlaw was worth real money to anyone willing to act on it. The reward posted for Jesse James by the state of Missouri reached $10,000 at various points during the 1870s and 1880s. That was more than most men in the region would earn in 10 full years of honest labor. So the paranoia these men carried was not irrational. It was the only sensible response to the situation they were in. You did not trust the bartender. You did not trust the man who sold you a horse. You barely trusted the family hiding you in their storm cellar because they were doing the same kind of math that everyone else was doing. Loyalty in outlaw life was not a given. It was a temporary arrangement that held precisely as long as it remained more convenient than the alternative. Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch addressed the problem partly by establishing a long-term base at Hole in the Wall, a remote canyon hideout in Johnson County, Wyoming. The geography did some of the work that trust could not. Narrow passes, high canyon walls, and terrain that was genuinely difficult to move through in force made organized pursuit harder than it would have been on open ground. Other outlaw groups used the Robbers' Roost region in southeastern Utah for similar reasons. These were not romantic hideouts chosen for atmosphere. They were defensive positions, selected for the same cold, practical logic a soldier would recognize immediately. But even Hole in the Wall was never truly safe. Nothing was. And every man who sheltered there understood that clearly. Now let's talk about the money, because the mythology of outlaw life is built almost entirely on the idea that the financial rewards were worth the risks, that the robberies paid. The Northfield Raid of September 1876 is probably the most famous single operation in James Gang history. 8 men rode into Northfield, Minnesota with the intention of robbing the First National Bank. The gang included Jesse and Frank James, Cole, Jim and Bob Younger, Bill Chadwell, Clell Miller, and Charlie Pitts. What followed was not the clean operation they had planned. The citizens of Northfield fought back immediately. Hardware store owners and townspeople grabbed rifles and opened fire from storefronts and second-story windows. Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell were shot down in the street. Charlie Pitts was killed later, during a running engagement near Madelia, Minnesota, 2 weeks into the manhunt that followed. The 3 younger brothers were captured after one of the largest organized pursuits the state had ever mounted. Jesse and Frank James were the only 2 who made it out of Minnesota alive. Inside the bank, the acting cashier, Joseph Lee Haywood, had refused to open the vault. He told the robbers the safe was on a time lock and could not be opened. The vault was not on a time lock. It was fully accessible during business hours. But the robbers believed him and then shot Haywood when he continued to resist them. The vault held $15,000 in cash, completely untouched. The cash drawer yielded $26.70. That is what Jesse and Frank James divided between them after one of the most expensive and catastrophic operations in American outlaw history. The figure that often circulates, describing $26 per man, is a misreading of the record. The $26.70 was the total recovered from the cash drawer for the entire gang. The actual documented number is more stark than the myth. Now, Northfield was a genuine disaster on a scale most operations never reached. Not every robbery ended that badly. The more typical, successful train robbery of the 1880s generated somewhere between $2,000 and $6,000 total, depending on what was sitting in the express car. Split across a gang of 8 to 12 men, that worked out to somewhere between $200 and $750 per person for a single job. That sounds like real money until you start accounting for where it went. Safe house operators expected payment. A family sheltering 3 or 4 men through several weeks expected to be compensated, and they were in a position to set the terms because the alternative for the outlaws was exposure. Horses cost money. Good horses, the kind that could outrun a pursuing posse over hard country, cost significantly more. After a long chase or a difficult ride, horses were often lame, spent, or gone entirely. Replacing them required cash immediately available. Gear wore out at a steady pace in hard country. Saddles cracked. Guns required repair and maintenance. Boots failed after hundreds of miles. And if a man was wounded and needed medical attention, he could not walk into a town clinic and give his real name. He needed a doctor willing to treat him in silence. And that kind of silence always carried a serious price. Beyond the direct costs, there was the arithmetic of time itself. A gang planning a major job might spend 2 or 3 months in preparation, execute the operation over the course of a day or two, and then spend another 2 or 3 months lying low in the aftermath. In a productive year, a working outlaw might take part in 2 successful operations. In a lean year, maybe 1. In the long stretches between, there was no income. Bill Doolin's Oklahombres were considered one of the more consistently active outlaw groups of the early 1890s. They hit banks and express cars across Oklahoma Territory with reasonable regularity. And yet, by the time the gang was finally broken apart, most of its members had little to show financially. Several were reportedly in debt to the people who had hidden them. Butch Cassidy was, by most accounts, the most operationally disciplined outlaw leader of the era. He planned carefully, avoided unnecessary exposure, and kept his most trusted inner circle deliberately small. The Wild Bunch train robbery at Wilcox, Wyoming in June of 1899 reportedly netted somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000. That is the kind of number that sounds genuinely transformative. But it was also the operation that brought the full weight of the Pinkerton Detective Agency down on the Wild Bunch. And from that point forward, Cassidy's ability to continue operating inside the country became unsustainable. Within 2 years, he and Harry Longabaugh had left America entirely. The money was real when it came, but the cost of earning it and the cost of staying alive long enough to spend any of it consumed most of what was ever made. And what do you think? Could you have managed the economics of that life? Drop it in the comments. The financial pressure was corrosive, but the psychological weight of sustained outlaw life may have been worse, and it lasted longer. Trust is something most people extend almost automatically in ordinary life. You trust the person taking your money across a counter. You trust the stranger passing you on the street. You trust that giving your name to someone is an unremarkable transaction. Outlaws in the American West had to strip that instinct out completely, and the effort left visible marks on the men who tried to live this way over years. Jesse James, in the final stretch of his life, became increasingly difficult and erratic, even by the standards of men who had ridden with him for over a decade. He moved his family repeatedly, insisted on operating only under aliases, and grew deeply suspicious of people who had been loyal to him for years. The paranoia was not irrational. By 1882, the reward attached to his name had reached a level that made betrayal a perfectly reasonable financial calculation for almost anyone in his immediate circle. It was Robert Ford, a younger man who had been brought into the reconstituted James gang relatively recently, who eventually accepted a deal from the Missouri governor. On April 3, 1882, Ford shot Jesse James from behind while James stood in his own home, adjusting a picture frame on the wall. The betrayal did not come from a rival gang or from a Pinkerton agent. It came from someone Jesse had trusted enough to bring inside. Cole Younger, after serving more than 2 decades in the Minnesota State Prison following the Northfield disaster, wrote and spoke at length about the psychological cost of the years he had lived as a wanted man. He described the permanent alertness, the inability to rest without part of the mind staying on watch, and the way every unfamiliar face became a threat to be evaluated before it could be treated as a person. He said that after enough years of that kind of existence, a man stopped recognizing himself. Bill Doolin tried to find a way out. In early 1896, with most of his gang gone and his options narrowing fast, Doolin surrendered to Deputy Marshal Bill Tillman, apparently believing some kind of negotiated arrangement might still be possible. He was placed in a jail in Guthrie, Oklahoma, managed to escape, and was tracked down and killed by a posse later that same year. His attempt to walk back toward an ordinary life ended the way most such attempts ended. The internal collapse of outlaw gangs followed patterns that are recognizable in hindsight. Sustained law enforcement pressure tightened the circle of trust until almost nobody inside it felt reliable. Money became scarce during the long, quiet stretches between jobs. Men who had accepted the risks when things were going well became unpredictable when they were not. Informants came forward. Arrangements were made with prosecutors and governors. The Dalton Gang was finished at Coffeyville, Kansas on October 5, 1892, when 4 of its members were killed in a failed attempt to rob 2 banks simultaneously in broad daylight in a town where many people already recognized their faces. The plan had no realistic tactical basis and almost certainly reflected the kind of desperation that comes from running low on time and options. Bob Dalton had apparently convinced himself that one large score could reset everything. It did not. For most men who had spent years in this life, there was no graceful exit available. You could be killed in the act. You could be captured and spend the rest of your years confined. You could try to vanish entirely, a new name, a new region, a different version of yourself, and hope that the passing years quietly buried whatever trail was behind you. A few men pulled that off. Most did not. The life had a way of closing around a man until the choices simply disappeared. The mythology of the Wild West outlaw era suggests it ended because lawmen finally became skilled and determined enough to bring the gangs down. There are individual stories that support that reading. Pat Garrett tracking Billy the Kid to Fort Sumner in 1881. Bill Tillman's methodical pursuit of Bill Doolin across Oklahoma Territory. These were real men doing genuinely dangerous work, and their stories are worth telling. But the outlaw era did not end primarily because individual lawmen got better at their jobs. It ended because the conditions that had made sustained outlawry possible were systematically removed, one piece at a time, and because the American West stopped offering the kind of geography it once had. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was probably the single most consequential force in closing the era. Founded by Allen Pinkerton in 1850, the agency brought an organizational approach to criminal pursuit that no county marshal or small-town sheriff could replicate independently. The Pinkertons maintained detailed case files and updated them continuously. They circulated photographs at a time when most rural communities had no way of knowing what a wanted man looked like without seeing one in person. They coordinated their operations across state and territorial lines at a time when most law enforcement authority stopped at a county border. And they pursued targets with the kind of institutional persistence that private funding and organized record-keeping could sustain indefinitely. The James family felt that persistence directly. In January of 1875, Pinkerton agents mounted a nighttime raid on the James family farmhouse in Clay County, Missouri. Jesse's young half-brother, Archie Samuel, was killed, and Jesse's mother, Zerelda, lost part of her arm in the incident. The operation was widely condemned as a failure and generated genuine sympathy for the James brothers across Missouri. But it demonstrated something important about the level of pressure the Pinkertons were prepared to maintain, and for as long as it took. The telegraph was the other factor that changed everything. By the 1880s, the telegraph network covered most of the settled West. A robbery reported in one county could generate coordinated pursuit across a 100-mile radius within hours of the initial wire. The open country that had once allowed outlaws to simply ride hard and vanish into distance was increasingly covered by communication infrastructure that made organized, multi-jurisdictional response possible almost immediately. Train robberies that had once carried manageable risk began carrying a much higher probability of interception before the gang could disperse and go quiet. The railroads themselves invested heavily in the response. The Union Pacific and other major lines funded dedicated security operations, built ongoing relationships with law enforcement across multiple states, and were prepared to spend serious money protecting their express cars. Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch encountered this directly in the aftermath of the Wilcox robbery of 1899, when the Union Pacific deployed Pinkerton teams and specialized pursuit units that maintained steady pressure on the gang for months, making normal operations inside the country effectively impossible. And then there was the simple, unavoidable fact of space. The frontier west of the 1870s, with its vast stretches of unmapped territory and genuinely remote regions where a man could disappear for months without any organized search reaching him, was effectively gone by 1900. Oklahoma Territory became the state of Oklahoma in 1907. The canyon country of Utah and Wyoming was mapped, traveled, and increasingly settled. The hideouts that had once been genuine sanctuaries became less isolated every year, as the railroads and the telegraph lines and the settlers continued pushing into whatever open ground remained. There was nowhere left to run that was far enough. The last major outlaw operation of the era, by most historical assessments, was Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, which wound down in America around 1901. Cassidy and Harry Longabaugh traveled to South America, eventually settling in Argentina, where the evidence suggests they genuinely attempted for several years to live as honest ranchers. But the skills and instincts of that earlier life are difficult to set aside permanently, and the two men were reportedly killed in a confrontation with Bolivian soldiers sometime around 1908. The precise circumstances have never been fully confirmed, and their final chapter remains one of the genuinely unresolved questions of the era. The outlaw era did not end with a single dramatic moment. It closed gradually, as the exits were blocked one by one. The technology moved ahead of the tactics. The geography stopped cooperating. The money, which had never been as reliable or as plentiful as the legend suggested, became harder to earn and harder to hold on to. And the men who had staked their lives on open country and open options found, in the end, that the frontier they had counted on was simply gone. If you made it to the end of this one, drop a comment and tell me which of these gangs you think came closest to actually making it work on their own terms. Was it Cassidy's careful planning? Or was there something about the James Gang's run before Northfield that had a better foundation? I want to read your take, and if this is the kind of history you are after, subscribe to Spent Brass. We will keep going back through the American West and finding the parts the legend tends to leave out.